Hi, everyone. Welcome to All Free, a podcast for collective liberation.
Feeling the momentum of other people realizing that our liberation is interconnected, that our joy is interconnected, that this is not about being saviors or even allies. This is like what we are all working towards for our mutual liberation.
It's really false notion that the state can provide safety at the helm of other people's lives, as if safety could ever come from harming other people.
For us to be free, everyone must be free.
I'm playing different role, and Hannah's playing different role. Dima is playing different role. That it's all contributing into the better world that we wish to see for our children and the future generations.
Today we're welcoming a very special guest, Julie Weitz. She is an artist, writer, and educator who uses performance and storytelling to explore resilience and heal wounds of diasporic culture. Her work spans film, installations, photography, bringing to life figures from Yiddish folklore to connect with themes of lost, resilience, and repair. Julie draws on Yiddish concepts and reimagines them as frameworks for radical Jewish diasporism and solidarity with global liberation movements. Through her art, she reclaims cultural significant sites and invites reflection on the past, present, and the future of Jewish identity and healing. Julie, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited for this conversation and really diving into your work and expertise.
Thank you for having me. It's such an honor to get the opportunity to talk with you both and to also ground in this idea of collective liberation, which sometimes feels so far off from what's possible, but also is like the fire that keeps the fuel burning.
Yeah, I know we feel very much the same. I'd love to understand, kind of asking some foundational questions about your work and the context of your work. So you talk about healing the wounds of diasporic culture. Can you elaborate a little bit on what that wound is or what those wounds are and what that means?
Yeah, I mean, I would speak from my family lineage as an Ashkenazi Jew of Eastern European descent. Um, Those wounds are the wounds of pogroms, of European anti-Semitism, of the Holocaust, and then of assimilation and white supremacy in America, and then nationalism and Zionism. And how I think part of my ongoing learning process is deepening my connection to Yiddish culture, which is like the culture of my lineage on all sides. And yet Yiddish is a language, though it was spoken, the mother tongue of my great grandparents who all immigrated here by 1905. As they assimilated into white American culture, they dropped that language. Now they kept it in a kind of cutesy way. So many people sort of think of Yiddish as like funny and nostalgic, but actually it was like a deep, rich spoken language for 1,000 years. And particularly in the 20th century, there's an incredible lineage of Yiddish song and Yiddish poetry and visual Yiddish culture. So that has been part of my investigation, is like reclaiming that and really feeling into what it feels like in an embodied way, and then how that resonates outwards in terms of like acknowledging the way that, years, centuries of anti-Semitism, but then more recent lineages of forced migration and assimilation has distanced me from what is this rich diasporic culture that evolved over 1,000 years in Europe.
That's beautiful. I think often when we focus on, dismantling something like Zionism or some of these ideologies that we're confronted with, and we're not thinking about what we're building and what we're cultivating and what we're bringing forth, it can feel quite empty. And so your exploration of Yiddish art and folklore and writing plays such a critical role in identity and understanding and all of that. What brought you to this work? What brought you to, what inspired this?
Yeah, I mean, I wanna name something that I heard you say and really state it clearly is that you that the way that I was raised in a Zionist home. And Zionism, particularly in America, has become equal to Judaism in a way. Like it's assumed that we have adopted this kind of culturally Zionism and almost like religiously Zionism, even though Zionism was originally a secular movement. And I believe that part of that is, I mean, one part is the influence of ethno-nationalism in general, but then there's, the the Shoah, the genocide that like really distanced us even more from this cultural lineage. So it's kind of like this mixed up thing. It's an eclipsing through nationalism, but also this like deep grief and loss that I think hasn't been processed. So what brought me to this? Actually, I mean, I think at different points in my life, I had been curious about Yiddish culture, but then what happened is after the Unite the Right rally during Trump's first presidency, when they were chanting "Jews will not replace us" in such hateful, racist slogans, I really started imagining this kind of golem character. And a golem comes from Yiddish folklore, and it's this idea of like a clay creature that the mystics would bring into form out of clay and send out to seek justice or protection for the Jews. There's many iterations of this story in different towns across Eastern Europe. And it's really like it's speculative fiction. It's a way to like imagine protection for people that did not have protection. And so I started thinking about making a golem and having the golem take revenge on the white supremacists. And it was actually like a really goofy thing. I didn't think it was going to develop in a whole body of work, but I made these videos for Instagram in 2017, and I was also riffing off of silent film and kind of horror and a little bit of drag, and it took off. And what was interesting for me is like the idea of the golem is eventually that it's often used to talk about AI, because the golems grow exponentially to the point where they supersede their creator's control, and then they have to be de-animated. So there's always like a lesson in that idea of like the protector, right? Don't assume that your protector will always protect you. And so I really relinquished control of the project in the sense that like people would invite me to do things and I would say yes, and it kept evolving. And the wild thing for me right now is looking back at that work, that was all instigated as a response to Trump's presidency, the first one, the xenophobia, the hate. And I just felt so deep within me that I had to like respond, but specifically respond in like an exaggerated, clownish way that also spoke to my own identity and why I felt committed to these issues of justice because of where I come from and my family comes from. And so I started performing the character at immigrant justice protests. I had already been involved in different protest groups, and I asked people, could I bring a little political theater? And people received the golem character so well. But now, like seeing what's happening and, the ramping up of ICE, or at least the rhetoric, because as I'm hearing, like these deportations have been going on through Biden's presidency, right? It's just the rhetoric is so increased, and I've been looking at some of that past work, and I think it's just, the crises are ongoing, and so I think a question as an artist is like, how do I serve this moment? And somehow, in various pathways have led me to like fully embody the Yiddish characters. And one more thing maybe I'll say about it is another aspect of the process of embodying these characters has been examining my own internalized anti-Semitism. And that became clear to me when I started studying the lineage of Yiddish performance. Because my family, there's a lot of Yiddish performance in my family. Like my grandparents' family, my grandparents' generation, I have photographs of them from the 1950s in Chicago, like fully dressed up in drag, doing strip teases, like total caricature kind of vaudeville, which comes straight out of Yiddish theater. And I used to be very embarrassed of that. It was like a little bit, I was just embarrassed. Like it was too Jewish. Like it was, it doesn't fit into like white Christian normative culture. And that's part of this kind of liberatory aspect of performing these characters is I'm just going to the nth degree, like going so full on in a kind of Jewish caricature that of course brings up, it can be triggering or it can be, frightening to people to face a projected stereotype or fantasy, which is something I'm examining here where I'm now in Berlin, like this, and this is a whole nother conversation. So maybe I'll pause and let you ask.
Julie, I do have a follow-up question for you. As you were, you used the word reclaiming, which I love that word in general. I think it's just a powerful word. But do you feel like in reclaiming Yiddish culture, which it was also really interesting to hear that for you, as a young person, it was embarrassing, and now it's something that you're reclaiming, and I can totally resonate with some of those like feelings of pressure about your own identity, and then wanting to embrace it. Do you feel that it can help? This can be a helping thing for creating community within the Jewish diaspora, because I have heard that with what's going on in Gaza and Palestine, that there are a lot of Jewish people feeling very silenced and feeling very isolated because they don't agree with what's happening, but they live in communities where the more vocal people are very, very nationalist. Is this a way, are you seeing this as a way to really create strength and community?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, there's a phenomenon in this niche cultural world of a lot of young people, especially young queer Jews, coming to study Yiddish. And it's because Yiddish also has a lineage of radicalism and queerness. So so much of Yiddish culture of a certain era is a kind of the labor movement and the Bundist and a kind of workers' rights. And even in, there's a lot of like queer Yiddish poetry or queer Yiddish performance. And it's like embracing the transgressive, especially in the transition of modern Jewish culture from a kind of religious to a secular society. And the other thing is that, here's a question, like for like Ashkenazi Jews, like why aren't we taught Yiddish? Why are we taught Hebrew? Now we're taught Hebrew if you grow up religious, like I did, to learn the prayers, right? But why learn modern Hebrew unless you're going to live in Israel, right? So for me, it's like I think we should be teaching Yiddish, because this is the loss of the culture. You have to learn it through the language. And I'm still a beginner in this language, but it is such an amazing phenomenon to be surrounded by young Yiddish speakers and to understand the depth of culture that was lost. So here's this other thing that I'm big on is the numbers of Jews killed in the Holocaust is it's difficult to contain mentally. If you just think of the void of culture that was lost, like 6 million Jews, and all of the culture that was created around that, and all of the wisdom and the medicine and these certain kinds of subcultures even within that, that is the kind of research that I'm indebted to, and also the researchers who are doing this work to bring forth this plethora of culture that has been lost, and I say that because that's where Zionism tries to replace it, but ethno-nationalism can never replace 1,000 years of diasporic culture. But that's the tension, I think, of this moment. And yeah, so back to your point. Like, I mean, I left Judaism for a while. I was raised in a very Jewish community family, but I left it when I was young because I was so angry about Zionism and about Israel. And yeah, I like had a sickness. You know, I grew up going to synagogue with an Israeli flag on the bima, on the in front of the Torah. It's like I don't understand. It doesn't make sense. Why do we have a political symbol in a spiritual space? Um, and it's only over the course of time that I've, especially coming through to Yiddish through my art practice, that I've healed some of those wounds and also found communities um, that are not centered around nationalism and Zionism.
Wow. Thank you for
That's a
sharing them.
Yeah, thank you. Hannah, I was going to ask a question about, because you brought up Bundists, which is something that was new to me to learn about. I learned about it reading Naomi Klein's Doppelganger book, and I think when she refers to it, she also talks about this sort of idea of culture and being here, like where you are. I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on the Bundist movement, and is there potentially a renaissance of that? Is it coming back? Yeah, and anything around like that, the concept of kind of here-ness too, which I found it fascinating when I read it in her book, and it sounds
Yeah,
like what you're talking about.
absolutely. And I love that Naomi Klein has made it more popular. And also this moment, I mean, since October 7th, like I think progressive Jews are so hungry for visions and lineages that are not associated with genocide and violence. Doikite is, which means here-ness in Yiddish, is something I came to a few years ago, and I was really taken by it, both as a political movement, but also for me, it's like a Ram Dass message of be here now. So, originally in the Bund, the early 20th or late 19th century, early 20th century labor movement, they have this quote that in Yiddish it translates as "wherever we are, that's our land." And it was specifically anti-Zionist. There was a time, especially in Poland in the early 20th century, where there were like multiple different kinds of Jewish political movements arguing with each other also. And 10% of Poland was Jewish. So it was the biggest demographic of Jews anywhere in the world. So Bundism was just one more of them, one more of the movements. And I also think about Doikite as a cultural movement. Like part of my practice now is site specificity. So I started the project in the US or Turtle Island, performing as these diasporic characters. And then I realized through this notion of Doikite, like, what would it mean to actually go back to the lands where my ancestors are from and where these myths proliferated? And were a part of everyday life, not just the golem, but also this character of the Dybbuk, which is a wandering spirit that possesses a living body. And so that ended up being this whole path of like ancestral work, going back to the towns where my great grandparents are from, in the countries that I could get into. Belarus and Ukraine is not accessible, and then feeling into the spirit of the land and the grief that the land is holding, and then using that as a starting point to generate performances, which has been a whole nother portal, and that comes from Doikite, like be here now. What does it mean to like situate myself in this land? And I want to add that like I was on a Fulbright last year in Poland, and I arrived in September 2023 with this notion of Doikite. Like, okay, what is this going to be for the year? I'd already been coming to Poland, exploring the history, doing performances, but now I was going to settle in for a year. And then October 7th happened. And I think for me, it just like pulled into clarity, into focus, like why Doikite was so important for me in this moment, because I needed to have that separation from this triangulation that I think is like, Poland, Israel, Palestine, Germany. Like how are all these places connected, and what does it mean for me to reroot in the lands of my ancestors with this notion of here-ness in relation to the violence that is now playing out, the genocide that is happening in Gaza, and also next door to Germany and the source of the violence. It's a lot. Even just saying all that, I'm like, eh. And I also want to follow up with something you asked about the Renaissance. I am in touch with people who are like fully committed to bringing back the Bund as a Jewish socialist labor movement in Poland specifically. I really admire that work, and I'm learning from it. I find myself more interested in the cultural aspect of it, rather than like a political organization.
Makes sense. But they seem to draw on some similar concepts, but you're right, one is more on the political side and one is more on the cultural side. I did want to ask you to talk a little bit about Germany, because you brought up that you're in Germany. It must bring up a lot of feelings being in Germany. I mean, Germany, there's, the wound of what has happened in Germany, but now this suppression that's happening in Germany of voices that are pro-Palestinian or questioning Zionism. I'd love to hear how that is manifesting for you.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason that I'm here is because of this moment and what it means, how Germany plays a role in this moment. And when I was in Poland last year, I kept visiting Germany and going to protests and witnessing the police brutality against pro-Palestinian voices, and also the solidarity that I saw taking place with Jewish and Palestinian activists and artists here. So it feels very potent. Like there's a very, very strange privilege that Jews have here in Germany, because the memory culture is so like the reason of state in Germany is to support Israel. And their form of reparations is for the Holocaust is support for Israel, like unquestioning support of Israel. And so it becomes this very strange dynamic where the memory culture has like completely embedded into the consciousness of, I would say, generally white German culture, that like the Jew is always the victim. And then if you come forward as a Jew who says, no, I first of all, I won't accept this fantasy projection, but also I won't accept this idea of, the Jewish state being an answer to the sins of the Holocaust, and also, name clearly the wrongs of the dispossession of the Palestinian people, and this understanding that, one genocide led to another, then in Germany, like you will be canceled, right? You'll be censored, you'll be squashed. And I think the solidarity work that I'm seeing, and I've only been here a few months, so I'm just stepping in, but it's really powerful, especially because the biggest Palestinian diaspora in Europe is here, and people are really well organized. But it has to be through events, for example, can only happen through private institutions. Anything public will be squashed, canceled, censored. And this is where like memory culture in general, where memory culture is about learning from the past, right? It's like, wow, Germany got it wrong. And I think a question I have is like, how do we begin to work towards a more integrated, multidimensional, multidirectional idea of how to remember like the ongoing harm of colonialism and genocide and of the past centuries.
Wow. As an artist and somebody who values self-expression, that must be a very difficult environment and tense environment to be operating in.
I think, I don't know. I think that my method of operating is like right now I'm really moving more into absurdity and clown work. So my only like technical performance training is in clowning. And people have an idea that that's like red-nosed clowns or something, but it's really like the lineage of like fools and tricksters and jesters. You know, every culture across the globe has some form of this character, a sacred clown. And I think in this moment, like the only way for me to respond, not the only, but a very resonant way for me to respond is with absurdity. So, for example, tomorrow night I'm doing a drag show with this character, the psychedelic Sadiq, and he's a psychedelic Hasidic Jew. It's a drag king, so I'm bearded and pretty convincing, I think, as a man. And yeah, like it upturns all of the stereotypes that especially white Germans might hold around Jewish culture, and we'll see. I've performed it one other time in Berlin, and at that performance, I interact with a watermelon, and I talk about collective liberation, and then I eventually, and what it means as a Jew to support Palestinian liberation, and then eventually I make watermelon juice and we say a blessing over it. So when I performed that, I think people were so surprised, and there was just such a sense of like, what is happening? Like, you can't be saying this thing if you look this way, and you know, I love that kind of confusion. And also the character is very joyous. So I think like just playing with a sense of celebration as a means to speak to the intensity of the harm is what feels natural to me.
I love to see these concepts and stories within Yiddish history, something that was, you know, the Nazis had the intention to eradicate, and now you and other artists are reviving it. And it not only seems to help to heal some of the, or process through some of the grief, and you're using these as tools for modern liberation movements. I think that there has been so many lessons that have been lost because of genocides and ethnic cleansings in the world, where cultures had these understandings of how to combat oppression and how to address state violence and systemic violence, and to bring in the jester and to bring in humor. A lot of that would be not people's first guess right now because it's not in most people's tool belt. So to bring that in as a liberation tool today is beautiful. Like really, I'm so inspired by that. And you talked a little bit about in the early 20th century, all these different Yiddish political parties. And I'm curious, there was a man you talked about when we chatted about a year ago, a rabbi that you were really inspired by, who was very liberation oriented. I would love to hear, I think he was referred to as one of the sensitive rabbis. Would you mind sharing a little bit about him and how his story has impacted you?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. His name is Rabbi Aaron Shemu'el Tamares. And I only learned about him in the last 2 years, and he actually named himself one of the sensitive rabbis. It was his pseudonym, which he used because he started writing these political critiques, and he didn't want to be outed because it was like, it was provocative. So he was writing in the early 20th century in eastern Poland in a small town called Milichice, and he actually was an early Zionist. He joined the movement. He like went to the Fourth Zionist Congress, and then he quickly left because he saw and wrote very prophetically that when you bring Judaism and nationalism together, you're only going to create violence. And then he started writing these really sharp and sometimes funny political critiques against nationalism and against Zionism and for liberation, like and for nonviolence as a way to solve, the problems of the 20th century. And he was writing also after World War One, and during that time, having witnessed the kind of violence that happened at a scale in Europe that hadn't been seen before, he was even more strongly pushing his position. And he also wrote really beautifully about the forests. And this is an aspect of a project that I'm developing right now because he saw the forest as a place of refuge and a place of contemplation. The reason I think he calls himself the sensitive rabbi is he is like attuned. He is like very spiritually present to the land, to the spirit of Judaism, to the lessons that he's reading through the story of Exodus, for example, that the whole formation of the idea of the Jewish people is based on liberation. And as it happens, he's an example of a voice that gets lost to history or lost, to the Holocaust because, well, he dies in 1931. But even though he published in many Hebrew and Yiddish newspapers and publications, but his work has only been translated into English in the past few years by this Rabbi Everett Gendler, who was a pacifist rabbi who did work with Martin Luther King. So there's a kind of like lineage of nonviolent Jewish advocates. And yeah, to find his writings in this moment has been like really soul soothing, right? Because we want to know that we have prophecy from our own traditions, whatever they might be, and that they're prophecy that aligns with our politics and our sense of the world. And at the same time, it's really tragic to read because he's seen everything that's going to happen. He's really laying out the kind of violence and specifically he says the spiritual deprivation that will come when we combine Judaism with nationalism. And this is where I just want to say, like, this is what I feel every day when I hear the news and I talk to friends who are in Palestine or connected to the land somehow, and just acknowledging that, like, this obsession over land and borders and territory has just completely eclipsed like the spirit of Judaism that I always grew up with, which was about justice and love and healing. And I really am in kind of deep sorrow every day for the ways in which this has co-opted our whole sense of being in Jewish community, this like perceived notion of safety, this really false notion that the state can provide safety at the helm of other people's lives, that in as if safety could ever come from harming other people. Yeah. And this is what he wrote about. So, yeah. I could say what I'm doing with his words of my project. Should I? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the project, it's been in the works for like 2 years almost. It feels like I'm working with this wonderful soul, Danya Voskaboynik, and he's a diasporic Jew, has lived in London, Russia, Argentina, now in Barcelona, and he actually introduced me to Tamarez's work. And we're developing this project called Hereland, and it is a kind of collective, collaborative vision for place-based creative practice that re-enchants Jewish diasporic imagination. So what does that mean? I think that there's a negative theology in anti-Zionism, even if I'm aligned with it. It's sort of I'm interested in like what it means to fan the fire of spirit through imagination. And given the depth of culture that I've spoken about that was lost in Yiddish land, and Yiddish land is this term that refers to the vast area, non-territorial area of where Yiddish culture once existed and still does. And last summer, we traveled to the town where Tamarez preached and lived for most of his adult life. And it just so happens this tiny, tiny village, like really like 2 streets, like the synagogue where he preached, which had been in ruins for decades, just recently was renovated. And the renovation was engineered by this amazing woman, Monica Bayut. And this is common in many Polish towns because almost every Polish town there was a Jewish population. And in Milichice, where Tamarez was, it was majority Jewish. And there are these non-Jewish Polish memory workers who are preserving Jewish memory in their town. So this woman, Monica, has like made it her life's work to preserve the memory. And she recently told me that she believes that she's the spiritual incarnation of the Rebbe, of Rabbi Tamarez. And here's how she ended up telling me this. Another interesting aspect about this location is that it's along the EU-Belarusian border. And it's along Europe's oldest old-growth forest, the Białowieża forest. So there has been a refugee crisis at the border, and dozens of refugees coming from Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria have died in the forests for lack of care. Because basically the EU policy and the Polish policy is to deport anyone who crosses the border from Belarus, and then Belarus throws them back in. So they're just used as pawns going back and forth. There's a wonderful film called The Green Border by Agnieszka Holland that really features this. So here we have the prophetic voice of this rabbi writing in the early 20th century against nationalism, against the problems that will come when we root our identities in nation statehood. And he's writing from the forests that are now this site of the EU-Belarusian border crisis. And these forests were also sites where partisans, Jewish and non-Jewish, hid from the Nazis, and whole Jewish communities hid from the Nazis and also were killed in these forests. So the question for me is like, how do these stories intersect, and how can we use these sites of past violence and present violence to understand how to heal? So what I'd like to do is bring people there. So I'm beginning to bring people to these sites and to ground in kind of creative practice and ground in the writings and the teachings and other forms of Yiddish wisdom that come forth in these lands. And it's a work in progress.
It sounds amazing. I mean, everything that you brought just like brings everything together, like the story of what's happening in the forest now, and like borders and nationalism, and how that has caused so much harm and lack of safety for people. And it really comes together just so profoundly. Thank you for sharing that. Because you brought up forests a couple of times, I know that you had written or have done work with a prayer in the past, and it has to do with forests. And when we first talked about it, you weren't sure if this was something that applied, but I think both Hannah and I felt like actually, when you think about it, everything is connected. And I don't know if you want to tell us a little bit about that prayer and maybe even read it for us.
Yeah, I would love to. So I co-wrote this prayer with my dear friend, Rabbi Zach Fredman, in 2021. And it's called A Prayer for Burnt Forests. I also turned it into a short film, but it came after I had to flee my home in Pasadena during an intense, catastrophic fire season. And I had already been doing work with wildland firefighters, particularly formerly incarcerated ones. And so I had been, living in Southern California for 10 years and really feeling the impact of wildfires. And now, the tragedy is the place where I once lived and where many of my friends lived in Altadena, and where these formerly incarcerated firefighters housed their program, this training program that I'd been um, contributing to, all of it burnt down. And so this prayer has felt even more present in this moment of the recent fires. Okay, so I'll read it. Oh, and I also want to just add that part of my learning around the catastrophic fire was understanding the the impact of colonialism, and that the indigenous stewards of Turtle Island had understood how to manage fires and use fire for good for centuries, before the Spanish showed up. So acknowledging that was really important. A prayer for burnt forests. Around my feet, I carve a circle in the earth and sing to you on behalf of the trees, the animals, and the water, all the peoples of the earth. From the ash of death, we reach to the source of life, ecosystem of being, whose presence has been called by all the ancestors who've gone before us in many forms, by many names. We call to you, angels of creation, earth, water, wind, and fire, from land that is not ours. We who live by your gifts and study your ways, take heed of your natural law. All that gives life takes life away. In reciprocity are your elements a blessing. We who forsake and defile the wisdom of indigenous ancestors ask forgiveness for our sins, dispossessing the people of cultural fire, denuding the forests of sacred trees. Lover of life, let us live. Let the rage of wildfire dim. Let the earth hold firm. Let the wind blow over us with kindness and grace. We who are made in your image, fragile creatures, call to your fragility. O force of mystery, I will not leave until your mercy stirs.
Beautiful. That is
Very
beautiful.
timely.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, Julie.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing, and thank you for joining us, and looking forward to seeing what comes next and seeing that these projects come into fruition. I'm really excited for everything that you're doing, Julie.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak and to talk with you today. I really, really feel nourished by the space that you opened up for me to speak.
We're so glad to have you.